The day Ida Whitfield buried her second husband, she told herself she was done with hope, and she meant it the way a woman means something when she has learned the hard way that meaning it is the only armor left to her. The sun over Morrow Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1883 was the kind of sun that bleached everything pale, pale dust, pale wood, pale faces under black funeral bonnets. Ida stood at the edge of the grave that the undertaker's boys had dug near the old cottonwood, and she did not cry. She had already cried everything out of herself years ago, and what remained was a woman of 32 who wore her grief like a second skin, so familiar and so constant she had stopped noticing the weight of it. Thomas Whitfield had been her second chance. Her first husband, Calvin, had died of a fever in the winter of 1876, leaving her with a small homestead outside of Morrow Creek and a daughter, Clara, who was then 4 years old. Thomas had come along 2 years later, a quiet man with steady hands and a decent heart, and Ida had told herself that decency was enough, that she did not need the thunderclap kind of love that the penny novels talked about, the kind she had believed in once when she was 17 and had not yet learned what the world was made of. Thomas had been decent right up until the consumption took him, slow and cruel, over the course of 18 months, leaving Ida with the homestead again, and now a 9-year-old daughter named Clara, and a set of debts that were not enormous but were persistent. The way a stone in a boot is not life-threatening, but will cripple you if you walk far enough on it. She had $63 in a tin box under the floorboards. She had 40 acres of dry but workable land. She had a milk cow named Bess, 6 chickens, and a vegetable garden that produced more stubbornness than vegetables. She had Clara, who had her mother's eyes and her father Calvin's tendency to ask questions that had no good answers. And she had a reputation in Morrow Creek for being capable and self-sufficient, and as old Mrs. Delaney put it with the particular fondness of a woman who meant well, not the sort who needs fussing over. Ida did not need fussing over. She needed a dry August and a good price on flour, and for the fence on the north pasture to stop falling down. She got none of those things immediately. What she got, 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral, was a broken axle on her wagon on the road between the homestead and town, 5 miles of dust and scrub brush with nobody in sight, a sun that was doing its worst, and Clara sitting on the side of the road eating a dried apple with the philosophical calm of a child who has learned that her mother will figure things out eventually. "Mama," Clara said, watching Ida crouch in the dirt and assess the situation with the expression of someone doing arithmetic on a chalkboard and not liking the sum, "are we going to have to walk?" "We are going to have to think," Ida said. "That's what you say before we have to walk." Ida looked at her daughter and felt a surge of love so sharp it was almost painful. "Yes," she admitted, "we are probably going to have to walk." That was when they heard the horse. He came from the direction of town, riding at an easy canter on a bay horse that moved with the loose confidence of an animal that had covered a great deal of ground in its life. He was not an especially remarkable sight at first. A man in a dusty coat, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat that had seen considerable weather. It was the kind of image that was perfectly ordinary in New Mexico Territory in 1883, a man on a horse on a dirt road, and Ida would not have given it a second thought if she had not been standing next to a broken wagon with her hands on her hips and nowhere particular to go. He slowed when he saw them. He did not make a show of it. He simply pulled his horse down from a canter to a walk and came alongside the wagon and looked at the axle the way a man looks at a thing when he is trying to determine if it is a small problem or a large one. "Axle," he said. "I am aware," Ida said. He looked at her then, and she looked at him, and there was a brief moment of mutual assessment that had nothing romantic about it at all. Just 2 people in the middle of a problem deciding whether the other one was going to be useful. He was perhaps 35, maybe a year or 2 younger, with a face that had been shaped by weather and work into something that was not conventionally handsome but was, she thought, honest. His eyes were a kind of gray-green that she would not have thought to notice if she had not been standing this close, and there was something in the steadiness of his gaze that she recognized, the look of someone who had also stopped expecting easy things. "Aaron Barker," he said and touched the brim of his hat. "Not a performance, just manners." "Ida Whitfield," she said. "That is my daughter Clara." Clara looked up from her dried apple and assessed him with the direct seriousness of a 9-year-old. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said, and his voice changed slightly when he spoke to the child, not softer exactly but more careful, and Ida noticed that too, filed it away without thinking about it. He dismounted and tied his horse to the side of the wagon and crouched in the dirt next to the axle the same way Ida had, looking at it with the same expression of a man doing arithmetic. "You have a spare. In the wagon bed. That is something at least." He stood and dusted his hands on his trousers. "I can fix it, take about an hour. You do not need to wait in the sun. There is a bit of shade over by those rocks." Ida looked at the rocks, which were perhaps 20 yards off the road and cast a modest shadow, and then she looked at this man who had appeared out of the dust and offered to fix her wagon as though it were a simple and obvious thing to do. "I can help," she said, because she could. Because she had learned to do things like this, not easily but competently, and she did not need a stranger's charity. "I know you can," he said, and there was not a trace of condescension in it. "I could use a second pair of hands on the front end while I work the back." That was different. That was not charity. That was practical. So Ida Whitfield stayed in the dirt and helped Aaron Barker fix her wagon axle in the afternoon heat of a New Mexico spring, and Clara ate her dried apple in the shade of the rocks, and the bay horse stood patient and still, and nobody said anything particularly notable for most of an hour. But there is a particular intimacy in working alongside someone, in the way silence becomes something shared rather than something absent, and Ida noticed it happening and she did not know what to do with it, so she did nothing with it, which was the safest option. When the axle was fixed and they had hauled themselves back up out of the dirt, Aaron Barker looked at his hands and then at the road ahead and said, "You are heading to town. For supplies. I am going that direction myself. No reason to ride ahead alone when the road goes the same way." It was logical. It was the kind of offer a person makes when it is the sensible thing. Ida told herself that, and it was true, and it did not explain why she said yes with something less than her usual brisk efficiency. They rode into Morrow Creek with Clara sitting between them on the wagon bench, asking Aaron Barker the kind of questions that children ask without diplomatic filter. How old was his horse? Where was he from? Did he have any children? Why not? What did he do for work? Where did he live? And Aaron Barker answered every one of them with the patience of a man who either liked children or was very good at pretending. And from what Ida could tell, watching from the corner of her eye, he was not pretending. He was, it turned out, a rancher. He had bought a piece of land about 7 miles east of Morrow Creek 2 years prior, after coming down from Colorado, where he had spent some years working cattle drives out of Pueblo. He had a modest operation, 40 head of cattle, a small house he was still improving, a hired hand named Pete who was more useful in theory than in practice. He was, as far as Ida could determine from 40 minutes of conversation filtered through her daughter's interrogation, a man who had made deliberate and careful choices about his life and was in the middle of building something. She found herself thinking about that on the drive home, the building of something. She had been so occupied with the maintaining of things, the fence, the cow, the garden, the money in the tin box, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to build rather than sustain. She did not think about Aaron Barker in the way a woman thinks about a man when she is hoping for something. She had made herself very clear on that subject. She thought about him the way she thought about an interesting observation, the kind of thing you notice and set aside, like finding an unusual rock on the road and putting it in your pocket because it is there, and because it is interesting, not because you have any particular plan for it. He came to her homestead 6 days later with a fence post and an auger. She was in the garden when she heard the horse, and she stood up and shaded her eyes and watched him ride up and dismount with the fence post under one arm, and she felt something move in her chest that she was determined to identify as irritation. "My north fence," she said. "I rode past it yesterday," he said. "3 posts down. That section faces the creek runoff. It will just keep going if you do not shore it up properly." "I was aware of the fence." "I know you were." He looked at her steadily with those gray-green eyes. "I had the post and the auger and I was riding this direction anyway. That is all it is, Mrs. Whitfield." She stood in the garden with dirt on her hands and looked at this man who kept appearing in reasonable and practical and entirely non-threatening ways, and she thought very carefully about what she was going to say. "The north fence is around the back," she said finally. "I will show you where the ground is hardest." They fixed 3 fence posts that morning, and Clara came out of the house at some point with 2 cups of water and handed one to Aaron without being asked. The way children make decisions about people with a simplicity that adults have lost. And Aaron drank the water and thanked her and went back to work. And Ida watched all of it and felt something stirring at the bottom of her chest like a pot starting to heat. He came back twice more that month, once to help her with the roof where the shingles had lifted during a wind, and once simply because he was riding past and stopped to see if she needed anything, and she said no, she was fine. And he said all right, and stayed for 20 minutes talking to Clara about horses while Ida stood in the doorway pretending to be occupied with something else and listening to every word. She was not a fool. She knew what this was, in the way that a woman who has been hurt knows what the shape of danger looks like even when it does not look dangerous. She knew that Aaron Barker was a good man who came around regularly and was kind to her daughter and helpful in ways that were practical rather than performative. And she knew that this was precisely the kind of thing that could undo a person if they were not careful. So she was careful. She was careful through June, when he began coming to the Sunday socials at the church in Morrow Creek, always finding himself in the general vicinity of wherever she was standing, always easy and undemanding in his conversation, making her laugh twice and making her think 3 times, and leaving her with the unsettled feeling of someone who has been climbing a steep trail for so long that the absence of the climb feels wrong. She was careful through July, when the heat descended on the territory with its full brutality, and the whole of Morrow Creek moved through the days as though the air were something you had to wade through. And Aaron Barker organized a group of neighbors to help dig an additional well on the far side of town, and spent 4 days in the sun doing it, and came to her homestead on the 5th day looking exhausted and thirsty and somehow cleaner of soul than most men she had known. She gave him a plate of supper because it was the right thing to do, and because Clara had already set a place for him with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had made a decision and was simply waiting for the adults to catch up. They sat on the porch after while Clara slept inside, and the night came down over the territory with all its stars and all its silence, and the cicadas made their sound, and the air was finally bearable. "You are from Texas originally," she said. It was not a question. She had gathered this from various things he had said over the months. "Born there," he said, "near San Antonio, left when I was 20. Why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark. "My father had a way of running things that I did not want to be part of. Nothing criminal, just a certain way of being in the world that I thought was wrong. I wanted to do it differently." "Differently how?" He turned and looked at her, and in the starlight his face was something she could almost not look at directly, the way you cannot look directly at something that matters too much. "More honestly," he said. "With more regard for what people actually need rather than what they are supposed to want." Ida was quiet for a long time. The cicadas went on with their racket. "My first husband was a good man," she said eventually, because she was going to say it before he could. She was going to be the one who put it out in the open where it lived. "He died of fever. My second husband was also a good man. He died of consumption. I have been on this homestead for 7 years maintaining things, keeping things from falling apart. I am not complaining. I am telling you the facts of my life because I think you deserve to know them before this conversation goes any further." Aaron Barker did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I know about Calvin Whitmore, and I know about Thomas. Morrow Creek is a small town." "Then you know I am not a woman who is looking for something. I know that is what you tell yourself." The bluntness of it stopped her cold. Not unkind, not presumptuous, just honest in a way that she had not been prepared for, and she sat very still in her chair on the porch with her hands in her lap and looked at him. "That is a considerable statement," she said at last. "Yes," he said simply. "It is. I am not trying to push you anywhere, Ida. I am not that kind of man. I am just not willing to pretend I do not see what I see. And what is it you think you see?" He looked at her with those steady eyes, and the starlight was above them both, and the whole of the territory was dark and enormous around the small lit island of the porch, and he said, "A woman who is more alive than she is allowing herself to be." She told him good night shortly after that. She was firm about it, not unkind but definite, and he went without pressing, and she stood in the doorway and listened to his horse recede into the dark, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, not moving, not thinking in any organized way, just sitting with the feeling that had been accumulating in her chest for months, and that she had not been willing to name. It was the naming of it that she was afraid of. She had been through the naming of it before. She had been 17 once, and she had known what it was like to feel the whole world reorganize itself around a person, to feel that specific gravity that pulls you towards someone and makes everything else into backdrop. And she had learned twice that the world takes what you love if you love it loudly enough. That was not rational. She knew it was not rational. Grief is not rational, and the superstitions that grief breeds in the human heart are not rational, but they are real in the way that a bone set wrong is real, functional in most weather but aching when the storms come. Clara came to her in the kitchen around 9 o'clock, wearing her nightgown and carrying the serious expression she always wore when she had something to say that she had been working up to. "Mama," she said, "you should be asleep." "I like him," Clara said, "just that. Clean and simple the way children are." Ida looked at her daughter, this 9-year-old who carried 2 dead fathers in her history and who still managed to move through the world with a directness and an openness that Ida could not entirely account for. "I know you do," she said. "Do you, Clara? I am just asking." Ida pulled her daughter close and pressed her lips to the top of her head where her hair smelled like sleep and sun. And she did not answer the question, because the answer was more complicated than a 9-year-old needed to navigate, and also because she was not sure she could say it out loud without it becoming too real, and things that become too real can be taken from you. But the truth of it was yes. The truth was that somewhere between the broken axle and the fence posts, and the plate of supper and the conversation on the porch, Ida Whitfield had fallen into something that she had very specifically decided she was not going to fall into. And the falling had happened the way all the most consequential fallings do, so gradually, and then so completely that the moment of no return had passed without announcing itself. August came, and with it one of the worst droughts the territory had seen in several years. The creek that ran along the south edge of Ida's property dropped to a trickle, and then to a series of pools, and Bess the cow looked at the diminishing pasture with the philosophical resignation of an animal that has seen worse. The vegetable garden struggled. The chickens were irritable. The $63 in the tin box had become $41, and Ida had done the arithmetic on what she needed to carry the homestead through to the next spring, and the arithmetic was not kind. She did not tell Aaron. She did not tell anyone. She was Ida Whitfield, who did not need fussing over, and she put her pride on like a work coat every morning and went out and did what needed doing. But Morrow Creek was a small town, as Aaron had said, and things that people do not say are sometimes louder than things they do. And it was old Mr. Hartley at the general store who mentioned in passing to Aaron Barker that Mrs. Whitfield had been asking about credit. Just asking, mind, not asking badly, but asking the way a person asks when the numbers have gotten tight. Aaron came to her on a Thursday in the middle of August with no particular excuse this time. No fence post or auger or wagon wheel. Just himself and his horse, and a directness that she was beginning to understand was simply the way he operated. "I want to make you a proposition," he said, standing at the gate of her property with his hat in his hands. She crossed her arms and looked at him. "What kind of proposition?" "A business one first. I need a person I trust to manage the accounts for the ranch. Record-keeping, correspondence, the figures. Pete cannot write well, and I am better with cattle than with columns. I would pay a fair wage." He named a figure that was not insulting and was not excessively generous, but was exactly right, the way a person names a price when they have thought about it carefully rather than when they are trying to manipulate an outcome. Ida looked at him for a long moment. "And second," he met her eyes. "Second is personal, and you do not have to respond to it today or ever if you choose not to. But I would like to court you properly, Ida, with your permission. I am not offering you anything I cannot deliver. I am not a man of great wealth. I am a man with a working ranch and a half-built house and a great deal of intention. I know your history and I am not frightened by it, and I am not asking you to be anything other than exactly what you are." He paused. "You are too wise and too worn for fairy tales." "I know that. I am not offering you a fairy tale. I am offering you a life. A real one with all the difficulty and all the good of it together. That is all I have, and it is what I am asking you to consider." The world was very quiet for a moment. The sun hammered down on the dry ground around them. A chicken made a philosophical noise from the yard. Somewhere distant, a hawk called. Ida Whitfield stood at the gate of her homestead with her arms still crossed and her face absolutely still, and her heart doing something so violent and so terrifying inside her chest that she was grateful no one could see it. "The business arrangement," she said carefully, "I will accept." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, more like the easing of a tension he had been carrying. "All right. The other matter," she said. "I will think about it. That is all I am asking." She thought about it for 3 weeks. She thought about it while she rode to the Barker Ranch 3 mornings a week, and sat at the desk he had cleared for her in the front room, and went through his ledgers with the meticulous attention of a woman who had been managing her own accounts on a shoestring for years. She thought about it while Clara rode along with her sometimes. Sitting on the fence and watching, Aaron worked the cattle with the practiced ease of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. She thought about it at night when the homestead was quiet and the stars were enormous and the territory lay around her in its immensity, and she was alone with the particular loneliness that is not about company but about consequence. The ranch was honest. The books were in more disorder than she would have liked, but there was nothing wrong with the operation itself, just the disorganization of a man who was better at the physical work than the administrative side. She took to the work with the satisfaction of someone who has found the right tool for a task, and the ledgers came into order under her hands, and the numbers began to make better sense, and Aaron watched her work sometimes from the doorway with an expression she pretended not to notice. On the 4th week of September, when the drought had broken with a single magnificent rainstorm that turned the creek back into itself and made the whole territory smell of wet sage and possibility, Ida arrived at the ranch in the morning and found Aaron Barker standing on the half-finished porch of his house with a length of wood in his hands and a look on his face that said he had been thinking about something for a long time. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He set down the wood. "I have been building this porch for 2 years," he said, conversationally. "Every time I get close to finishing it, something more urgent comes up. The roof one season, the barn the next." He looked at the porch with a kind of rueful self-awareness. "It occurs to me that I keep finding reasons not to finish it." Ida tied her horse to the post and looked at the porch. It was, she realized, actually nearly done. 2 more sections of railing and some trim work and it would be complete. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because a finished porch on an empty house is lonelier than an unfinished one." The statement sat between them in the morning air. Ida walked up the steps of the unfinished porch and stood on it and looked out at the land, which was still damp from the rain, the grass showing a faint green that the drought had suppressed, the whole landscape exhaling with relief. It was a good view, the kind of view a person could stand in front of every morning and feel something. "My answer is yes," she said without turning around. "To the other matter, the one I told you I was going to think about." She heard him behind her, heard the careful way he moved, and then he was standing beside her on the unfinished porch, both of them looking out at the wet land. "You are certain," he said. "Aaron." She turned and looked at him. This man with his weathered face and his steady eyes. This man who had shown up with fence posts and offered her the exact truth about who he was and what he had to give, no more and no less. "I am 32 years old, and I have been widowed twice, and I have a 9-year-old daughter, and I am afraid of you in a way that I have not been afraid of anything in a very long time." She paused. "And yes, I am certain." He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was very careful and very tender and very real, and then he reached out and took her hand, the way a person takes something they intend to keep, firmly and gently at the same time. They stood on the unfinished porch in the aftermath of rain, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and the land spread out before them, damp and green and possible. The courtship of Ida Whitfield and Aaron Barker was not a thing of grand gestures and dramatic declarations. It was a thing of mornings spent working side by side and afternoons on the porch of the Barker Ranch, talking about everything from crop rotation to philosophy. It was Aaron teaching Clara how to properly saddle a horse, spending an entire patient Saturday on it without once showing impatience at the child's questions. It was Ida bringing order to the ranch's accounts and watching Aaron's operation begin to breathe more easily with the financial clarity, and the satisfaction of that being mutual rather than charitable. It was the first Sunday they walked into church in Morrow Creek together, and felt the town's attention land on them like a gentle rain, curious and mostly warm. And Aaron put his hand briefly at the small of her back as they went through the door, and Ida let him, which was, for Ida Whitfield, a considerable statement. Old Mrs. Delaney cornered Ida after the service with the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something and has finally got the chance. "He is a good man, Aaron Barker," she said, with the authority of a woman who has been the community's arbiter of character for 30 years. "I know," Ida said. "Thomas would have approved." Ida looked at Mrs. Delaney, at this small woman with her sharp eyes and her genuine heart, and felt something in her chest ease slightly, like a knot working loose. "I think he might have," she said. "There were complications, because there are always complications when two people who have each built their own walls start negotiating the space between them." Ida was accustomed to making every decision herself, and the habit of self-sufficiency had calcified, over 7 years of solitude, into something that could look like stubbornness from the outside. Aaron was a patient man, but he had his own fixed ideas about how things should be done, and there were 3 or 4 conversations in October and November that got sharper than either of them intended before they figured out how to navigate the overlap. The sharpest was about the homestead. Aaron had said something, in passing, about selling it once they were married, a practical suggestion framed as a question, and Ida had gone so quiet that he knew immediately he had stepped somewhere wrong. That evening she told him, with the precision of a woman who has chosen her words with great care, that the homestead was the thing she had held on to through everything, that it was where Clara had been born, where she had learned to be herself, and that she would not give it up as a matter of practicality. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt, and when she was finished he said, "Keep it. We will keep it. It is yours and it will stay yours." Just that. No negotiation, no conditions. He had understood what she was actually saying, which was not about the property at all, and he had answered the real question rather than the surface one. She loved him more after that, if such a thing was possible, in a way that was quieter and deeper than the initial dizzying recognition, a love that was rooted rather than aerial, something that grew into the ground rather than reaching toward the sky. He proposed to her in November, on the finished porch. He had finished it in October, working 3 evenings in a row while she was doing the accounts and Pete stood around being mildly unhelpful. And when she had come out of the house and seen it complete, with the railing even and the boards smooth, she had looked at him, and he had looked at her, and they had both understood that finishing it was also a statement. The proposal itself was simple. They were sitting on the finished porch in the evening, and he turned to her and said, "Marry me, Ida. Not because it is sensible, though it is sensible. Not because it is practical, though it is practical. Because I want to spend my life next to you, and I want to do it honestly and completely, and I want Clara to have a father who is going to be there, and I want you to stop carrying everything alone." She had her hands in her lap and she looked at them, and then she looked at him and her eyes were bright. Not with tears exactly, but with something that was adjacent to tears. The pressure of something that has been held a long time beginning to release. "You are going to have to be patient with me," she said. "I do not always know how to accept things, help, care. I am better at giving them than receiving them." "I know," he said. "That is fine. I am a patient man." "I am aware," she said, and then, "Yes." They were married in February of 1884, in the church in Morrow Creek, on a cold, bright day when the sky was that particular blue that only exists in the Southwest in winter, deep and impossible, the kind of blue that makes you feel that the world is larger than ordinary life allows. The whole of the town came, because small towns come to weddings the way they come to everything, with their curiosity and their goodwill and their covered dishes. Clara walked beside her mother and looked at Aaron Barker at the end of the aisle with a solemn and satisfied expression, the expression of a child who has seen something through to its correct conclusion. When the minister asked if anyone had objections, Clara shook her head very firmly, unprompted, and half the church laughed softly. Aaron Barker looked at Ida Whitfield in the blue winter light with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, and she thought, standing there, that this was the thing she had not known she was waiting for. Not rescue, not repair, not a fairy tale with its gilded promises and its tidy conclusions. Just a man looking at her with his whole face open, offering the actual truth of himself and her being willing to take it. The minister said the words and they said the words, and when Aaron pressed the plain gold band onto her finger, it was with a steadiness that felt like the whole meaning of it. "This is something I intend. This is something I mean." They kissed and the church made a sound of collective warmth, and Mrs. Delaney cried, and Pete, Aaron's hired hand, blew his nose loudly into a bandana, and Clara tugged on her new stepfather's coat sleeve the moment it was appropriate and said, "Does this mean I can name the new calf?" Aaron looked down at her with a smile that was the most unguarded thing Ida had ever seen on his face and said, "Absolutely." They settled into the ranch together, the three of them, with the careful negotiation of people who have each had to function alone, and are now learning the architecture of a shared life. Ida kept the homestead, renting it to a young couple named the Harrises who had come from Missouri looking for land, and the income from it went into a separate account that Aaron insisted remain in Ida's name, because he understood, without being told directly, that having something of her own was not stubbornness or lack of trust, but a fundamental need in a woman who had learned what it was to be without resources. She ran the accounts for the ranch with an efficiency that transformed the operation's financial picture within 8 months. Aaron's cattle were healthy and his land was good, but he had been losing money to disorganization, paying late fees, missing favorable market windows, not tracking his expenditures with the precision needed to make good decisions about expansion. Ida changed all of that, not dramatically but steadily, the way all real improvement happens, and by the summer of 1884 the Barker Ranch was operating with a solidity it had not previously had. Aaron noticed everything she did, and said so without making it a performance. This was something Ida had not been entirely prepared for, a man who paid attention and expressed it, who said plainly, "You did that well," or "That was a good decision," not as a compliment to manage her, but as the simple truth stated aloud. She found herself, over the months, learning to receive it, learning to say thank you without immediately deflecting to something else. And this was not a small thing. And Aaron knew it was not a small thing, and neither of them made a ceremony of it, which was exactly right. Clara bloomed. That was the word Ida found herself using in her private thoughts, bloomed, the way a plant blooms when it finally has adequate water and light. She had always been a bright and serious child, but there was a guardedness in her that Ida had always known was there and had always been unable to touch. The guardedness of a child who has experienced too much loss in a specific formative way and who has learned, without being taught, to keep her deepest investment just slightly back from the edge. Aaron did not try to fix this, which was probably why he succeeded at it. He simply showed up, every day, reliable and consistent and interested in her, specifically her questions and her opinions and her particular running observations about the world. And Clara came to him gradually, and then completely, the way children come to trust when trust has actually been earned. By fall of that year, she called him Pa without being asked, and without making a moment of it, just naturally in the middle of a sentence. The way speech reflects the interior when the interior has already settled something. The injustices of that time and that land were not invisible to Ida and Aaron. Morrow Creek sat in country that had, not long before, been Apache land, and the legacy of that was present in the landscape and in the people, and in the particular silences of certain conversations. Aaron had worked alongside Apache laborers in his time in Colorado, and had formed there a respect for those men that was not common, and that he carried forward into his dealings in New Mexico territory, where the government's policies toward the remaining native populations were a source of ongoing cruelty that most of the town preferred not to discuss in polite company. There was a family, the soldiers, a man named Calls the Wind, his wife Morning Star, and their 2 children who lived on the edge of the territory allotted them by the government, which was poor land on the dry side of the hills and barely sufficient for the life they were trying to maintain. Aaron had met Calls the Wind the previous year over a fence dispute that had been resolved equitably, and a slow, careful acquaintance had developed between them. When, in the spring of 1885, a dispute arose over water rights on a creek that ran along the boundary between their lands, Aaron sat down with Calls the Wind directly rather than through the county office, which would have been the slower and more adversarial path, and would have resulted in whatever outcome the government official preferred rather than what was actually fair. They worked it out between themselves over 2 long afternoons, the water to be shared according to season, and the agreement was not legal in any formal sense, but it was between honest men and it held. And this was not a small thing in a territory where such arrangements between white ranchers and native people almost never happened at all. Ida had been part of those conversations, bringing water and offering her opinion when asked, and what she saw in them strengthened something in her understanding of Aaron that she had already known, but that became more defined. He was a man who looked at the actual situation and applied the actual principle rather than the convenient one. In a time and place where injustice was so normalized as to be largely invisible, this made him unusual, and she loved him for it in a way that was separate from the warmth and the intimacy and the companionship, but was also part of the whole. The spring of 1885 brought something else as well. Ida found herself in late March, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning with a particular feeling that she recognized, and she looked at the cup of coffee in her hands and then out the window at the land, and she felt something that was large and terrifying and very much like joy. She told Aaron that evening, after Clara was asleep, sitting at the table in the lamplight. She was direct about it because she did not know how to be otherwise. He was quiet for a moment that seemed long but was probably only a few seconds, and then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that broke through the usual steadiness into something more open and more raw and more wonderful. And she realized that for all his patience and his self-possession, this was a thing that undid him completely, and she was moved by it in a way she had not expected. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "Are you well?" He asked first because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who asks the practical and important question before anything else. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Are you frightened?" "Yes," she said honestly. "A little." "So am I," he said, which was so unexpected and so honest that she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the chest and cannot be manufactured, and he smiled at her, and the lamp was warm between them, and outside the territory was dark and enormous and full of stars. The pregnancy was not particularly difficult, though it was not easy in the way that pregnancies in frontier conditions are never purely easy. Ida was healthy and practical about it, continuing her work with the accounts through most of the summer, and Clara, who was told with straightforward honesty, received the news with a brief period of calculation and then arrived at a position of enthusiastic approval. "A boy or a girl?" she asked. "We will not know until November," Ida said. Clara considered this. "I think a boy," she said. "We have enough girls." Aaron, who was listening from the doorway, made a sound that was half laugh and half something more tender. Morrow Creek in the summer of 1885 had a particular quality of life that Ida had not experienced in the years she had spent there before, the quality of a place that is home in the full sense rather than merely the geographical one. She knew these streets and these people, had known them for years, but there is a difference between knowing a place and belonging to it. And belonging has to do with what you are building there, not just what you are surviving there. She belonged now in both senses, and she knew it in the way you know a thing that has moved from thought to feeling, from the head to somewhere deeper. There were mornings when she would stand on the finished porch of the ranch house before Aaron was awake and watch the sun come up over the eastern hills and feel the particular completeness of a life that has struggled toward something and arrived. Not a perfect life, not an easy life. The fence still needed periodic attention, and the accounts still had their difficult months, and the territory was still vast and indifferent and capable of tremendous cruelty in the form of weather and illness, and the ordinary violence of a land that had not yet been entirely tamed. But it was her life, fully and actively hers, and she was living it rather than merely maintaining it. And the difference between those two states was everything. August brought a complication that was not life-threatening but was not nothing. A man named Ruford Cole arrived in Morrow Creek with a deed that claimed a portion of land on the eastern edge of the Barker Ranch, a parcel that Aaron had been using for grazing for 2 years, and that he had believed was his according to the sale documents he held. Cole was the kind of man who presented himself as reasonable in public, and whose reasonableness had a calculated quality to it, and his deed was either legitimate or it was a forgery. It was not immediately clear which. Aaron did not react with anger, which was the response the situation was designed to provoke. He was calm and methodical, and he rode to Santa Fe within the week with his own documents and a description of the situation, and he spent 4 days navigating the Territorial Land Office, which was, as most government offices in New Mexico Territory in 1885 were, a study in bureaucratic disorder. Ida managed the ranch in his absence with the competence that 4 years of frontier life had given her, and the additional competence that 7 years of managing everything alone had deposited in her bones. Pete was, as always, more useful in theory than in practice, but the ranch's daily operations were not especially mysterious, and Clara, now 11, was genuinely helpful with the livestock in a way that made Ida think that Aaron's patient teaching over the past year had found good soil. When Aaron came back from Santa Fe, he had a determination from the land office confirming his title to the disputed parcel, and Cole departed Morrow Creek without ceremony, and the matter was closed. Aaron came home in the early evening, and Ida met him at the gate, and he looked tired in the way of someone who has spent days in bureaucratic combat, which is a particular and grinding kind of tired, and she put her hand against his face briefly when he dismounted, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, and they stood there for a moment in the evening quiet before going inside. These were the things that made a life. Not the grand events, but the texture of days, the morning cups of coffee on the finished porch, the evenings at the table going over the accounts, the Sunday afternoons when Aaron would read aloud from whatever book he had acquired from the traveling bookseller who came through Morrow Creek twice a year, the Saturday mornings when Clara would come running into the house with some discovery about the land, a coyote track, an interesting stone, a cactus flower she had not seen before. And Aaron would set down whatever he was doing and look at it with genuine attention. Ida noticed all of it. She had always been a noticer, the kind of person who collects experience in precise detail, but she had spent a long time noticing things in a state of guardedness, noticing the world from behind glass. She was not behind glass now. She was in it, the warmth and the noise of it, and the vulnerability of that was real, and the rightness of it was more real. November arrived cold and clear. The baby was born on the 12th, early in the morning, delivered by Mrs. Garrett, who served as the town's midwife with considerable skill, and a matter-of-fact manner that Ida found deeply reassuring. Aaron was outside the door in the way of husbands in that time, close enough to be called and far enough to be out of the way, and Ida heard him out there, his occasional footstep, and it was a comfort even through the hard work of what she was doing. The baby was a boy, as Clara had predicted, round-faced and urgent in his opinions from the first minute. Aaron was brought in when it was done and stood beside the bed looking at this child, with an expression that Ida thought might be the most unguarded she had ever seen on a human face. This man whose steadiness was so much a part of him that its absence in this particular moment was breathtaking. "He is perfect," Aaron said, which was what new fathers say, and in this case was said with the utter conviction of someone who has looked at a thing and found it entirely correct. "He has your frown already," Ida said. Aaron looked at her with a smile that spread slowly across his whole face, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had not known it was possible to love someone in this many different registers, all the different notes of it, the companionship and the desire and the respect and the humor and the deep foundational certainty, all present at once like a chord rather than a single note. They named him James Aaron Barker. Clara came in to see him with the expression of someone who has been waiting and trying to be patient and has just barely succeeded, and she looked at her brother for a long, serious moment and then announced that he was acceptable. "High praise," Aaron said. "He is very small," Clara said. "He will grow," Ida said. "I know that," Clara said with the superiority of a child who has read books. "I am just noting it." The winter of that year settled over the ranch with its cold and its particular beauty, the mornings white with frost, the air sharp enough to make the world seem very precise and clear-edged. James grew with the vigorous single-mindedness of a healthy infant, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of a household that had expanded, noisier and more full than before, the work redistributed but not reduced, the exhaustion real but different in quality from the kind Ida had carried before, different because it was shared. She noticed in those months how completely her life had changed from the one she had been living 2 years before, not just the circumstances of it but the interior of it, the way she moved through her days, the way she received the world. She had been armored for so long, and the armor had been necessary. She did not regret it or condemn it. It had kept her whole. But there is a difference between wearing armor because you need it and wearing armor because you have forgotten how to take it off, and she had been doing the latter for longer than she had realized, and the slow process of setting it down had changed the quality of everything. She told Aaron this one evening late, when James was asleep and Clara was asleep, and the fire was low, and the ranch house was quiet around them. She told him that she had been afraid before him, That opening again after the kind of loss she had experienced was the same as choosing to be destroyed again. That love was a risk she had decided was not worth the return on investment. He listened to all of it without interruption, which was one of his great and consistent gifts. "And now," he said. She looked at him in the firelight, this man who had shown up with a fence post and a fair wage and the exact truth of himself, and had not wavered once in all the months and years of being known by her. And she said, "Now I think that what I was afraid of was the wrong shape. I was afraid of losing again. But what I had been protecting myself from was living." Erin reached over and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with the unhurried tenderness of a man who is entirely where he wants to be and knows it. "You were never not living," he said. "You were the most alive person in every room you were in. You just were not letting anyone else know it." She took his hand when it came away from her hair and held it, and the fire settled in the grate. And outside the territory was cold and clear and enormous and full of stars. And inside the house was warm with all the specific and particular warmth of a life that has been built rather than found. In the spring of 1886, Ida organized the ranch's accounts for the year-end summary and found, with a satisfaction that was both professional and personal, that the operation had turned its best profit to date. She brought the ledger to Erin at the kitchen table and showed him the numbers, and he looked at them and then at her and said, "You did this." "We did this," she said. "The land and the cattle are mine," he said. "The organization that makes them worth anything is yours." "Then it is ours," she said, which was not a revision but a completion. He looked at her with that expression she had catalogued over the years, the one she had not had a name for initially, and then had found the right word for cherished. He looked at her as though she was something cherished, which was distinct from being admired or desired or even loved. Cherished had a specificity to it, the particular regard of someone who knows the full value of what they have. That spring also brought something that was less happy. Word came through the territory of increased pressure from land speculators backed by Eastern money. Men who were moving through New Mexico acquiring land by whatever means were most convenient. And the arrangement that Erin had made with Calls the Wind regarding the water rights was suddenly of interest to one of these speculators, a man out of Albuquerque who wanted the water access that the shared arrangement represented. The speculator, whose name was Donahue, approached Erin through an intermediary, which was a method of approach that Erin found immediately suspect. The intermediary offered to buy Erin's water rights at a price that was fair on its surface, but would have effectively ended Calls the Wind's access to the water and pushed his family off their already marginal land. Erin declined. When the intermediary pressed, Erin was explicit. He had a prior arrangement with his neighbor that he intended to honor, full stop. Donahue arrived in person shortly after at the ranch, and he was the kind of man who expected that persistence and money would eventually overcome principle, because in his experience they usually did. Erin received him on the porch with the courtesy he extended to everyone, and the immovability that had characterized him in every difficult situation Ida had observed, and he said the same thing to Donahue in person that he had said through the intermediary, with the addition of, "And I would ask you not to come onto my land again without an invitation." Donahue left, and was seen no more. The water arrangement with Calls the Wind continued undisturbed, and in the summer Calls the Wind came by the ranch with a horse he had trained, a gray that moved with extraordinary grace, and gave it to Erin without much ceremony as a statement of something that did not require elaborate translation. Erin accepted it in the same spirit, and the gray became part of the Barker Ranch's small remuda, and Clara immediately fell in love with it. The years that followed were the years of a life in full. They were years of work and weather, and the incremental building of something that grew more solid with each season. They were years of Clara growing from a serious 11-year-old into a serious teenager, carrying her mother's precision and her stepfather's patience, reading everything she could find, helping with the accounts with a natural aptitude that made Ida feel a particular pride. The pride of watching someone find the thing they are good at. James grew from a vigorous infant into a vigorous toddler, then a vigorous small child with his father's coloring, and his mother's eyes, and a personality that was entirely its own, bold where Clara was careful, loud where his sister was measured, throwing himself at the world with a physical confidence that kept Ida in a state of low-level anxiety, and Aaron in a state of constant amusement. "He is going to be a handful," Ida said one afternoon in the summer of 1888, watching James attempt to climb the fence of the stock pen with the determination of a small person who has not yet had enough close calls to develop caution. "He is going to be fine," Aaron said. He was watching with the same vigilance but with more equanimity, and he added, "He gets the fearlessness from you." Ida looked at him. "I am not fearless." "You are one of the bravest people I have ever known," he said simply. "That is different from fearless. Fearless is just not knowing. Brave is knowing and doing it anyway." She thought about that for a while, about who she had been when Aaron Barker had ridden up to a broken wagon on a dusty road in 1883, and about who she was now, and about the long, careful path between those 2 points, all the small choices that had accumulated into a life. "You should not say things like that," she told him. "Why not?" "Because they are very good things to say, and I am not sure I always know what to do when you say them." He smiled at her, that slow-spreading smile that had become one of her most beloved sights in the world. "After 5 years," he said, "I think you are entitled to just let them land." She let them land. In the fall of 1888, Clara, now 15, began helping the schoolteacher in Morrow Creek with the younger children a few days a week, a development that seemed to suit everyone and that gave the first clear indication of what she might want to make of herself. There was talk in the territory of expanded schooling, of training teachers more formally, and Ida had begun quietly corresponding with an institution in Santa Fe about what the requirements might look like and what the process was. She had not told Clara yet. She was gathering information first, making sure what she was offering was real before she offered it, because that was how you treated a person you respected. You did not give them hope built on sand. Aaron knew. He was the one she thought things through with now, the one she consulted and argued with and brought her best ideas to, knowing that he would take them seriously and tell her what was actually true rather than what she wanted to hear. He had said about the teaching idea, "If you tell her about it and it does not work out, she will be disappointed. If you do not tell her and it works out, you will have given her a gift. Get the information first." Which was exactly what she was already doing, but it was good to have it confirmed. "I already knew that," she said. "I know you did," he said. "I am just agreeing with you." She appreciated that he did that. She appreciated it more than she had initially expected to. The way a partner can agree with you, and in agreeing make you feel more certain of yourself. Not because you needed the approval, but because the agreement of someone you respect is not the same as approval. It is something more mutual and more honest. By Christmas of 1888, Ida had the information from Santa Fe, and she sat down with Clara on the day after Christmas while the ranch was quiet and James was napping, and Aaron was doing something outside, and she put the correspondence on the table and said, "I want to talk to you about something." Clara read the letters with the focused attention that she brought to everything, and when she was finished, she looked up at her mother with an expression that Ida recognized as the same expression she herself wore when something was simultaneously exciting and terrifying. "Teaching," Clara said. "It suits you," Ida said. "If you want it. How would we manage it? The cost, the traveling to Santa Fe for the training." Ida looked at her daughter, this 15-year-old who had grown up on a frontier homestead and had never had the luxury of being impractical, and she felt a surge of something that was beyond love. It was something more like recognition, the recognition of seeing yourself in someone and being glad of it. "Your father and I have been putting money aside," Ida said. "Not a fortune, but enough to start." Clara sat very still for a moment, and Ida saw her absorb this, the fact that Aaron had been saving toward her future without her knowing it, and she saw the particular way that landed in the girl, the way a person registers being planned for, being included in someone's future tense, and she saw Clara's composure waver just slightly around the edges before she brought it back. He knew about this, Clara said. It was partly his idea. Clara was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "He is a very good man." "Yes," Ida said, "he is. I get to name the next calf, right?" Clara said, which was her way of closing the emotional moment and moving on, and Ida recognized that too, because it was her own habit, and she loved her daughter for it. "Absolutely," she said. Spring came to New Mexico territory in 1889 with its particular ferocity, warm days and cold nights and thunderstorms that arrived from the south like proclamations. The ranch was thriving. The accounting system that Ida had built over 6 years was now sophisticated enough that Aaron was able to make decisions about the herd with a financial precision that was rare among ranchers of his scale, and the results were visible in the quality of the operation. They hired a second hand that spring, a young man named Robert Day who had come up from Texas looking for work, young enough to be taught properly and smart enough to learn, and who became, over the following months, a genuine asset in a way that Pete had never quite managed to be. Pete, for his part, had drifted to other employment in Morrow Creek, finding that the general store had need of someone who could lift heavy things and be reliably pleasant to customers, which played more to his considerable strengths. The summer of 1889 was hot and ordinary and very good. James was 4 years old and had opinions about everything, and there was a particular afternoon in July that Ida would return to in memory many times over the years, when she and Aaron sat on the finished porch in the late light and watched James running in the yard after one of the chickens, with the full earnest effort of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned that chickens are not catchable, and Clara sat on the fence reading with the casual grace of someone in her element. And the land was golden in the evening light, and Aaron had his arm around Ida's shoulders in the easy way of two people who have been close long enough that proximity has become instinct. She put her head against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him and thought about the woman she had been on the day her second husband was buried, standing at the edge of a grave in the bleaching sun telling herself she was done with hope. She had been wrong about that. Not weak for hoping again, not naive, not foolish. The hope she had found its way back to was not the glittering, ungrounded hope of 17, not the hope that asks the world to be something other than itself, but the specific and earned hope of a woman who has looked at a real man offering a real life and said yes, this, with eyes fully open. "What are you thinking?" Aaron asked. She turned her face up toward his. "That I am very glad you fixed my wagon axle," she said. He laughed, and it was the best sound, easy and genuine, and he pressed his lips to her temple, and the evening went on around them, warm and loud with the ordinary life of their family, and everything was exactly as it was, which was to say it was everything. In the fall of 1889, something beautiful happened quietly, the way the best things sometimes do. Clara turned 16, and the correspondence with Santa Fe had become a real plan. A year away, after her 17th birthday, she would go for 6 months of training and come back a qualified school teacher, the school in Morrow Creek having already informally agreed to consider her. She moved through the fall with the particular energy of someone who has a future they can see, and Ida watched her and felt the completion of something she had started years ago, the work of making sure that her daughter had more choices than she herself had been given. Aaron watched too, and one evening he said to Ida, "She is going to be remarkable." "She already is," Ida said. "You made her that way." Ida thought about it. "We made her that way," she said, using the same word she had used about the ranch because it was true in the same way, the product of combined effort of showing up consistently over years. Aaron was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" "About another child." She looked at him. James was 4 and vigorous and entirely sufficient to keep 2 people occupied, and she was 38 years old, which was not ancient but was not the uncomplicated territory of 25. "Have you?" she said. "Not urgently," he said. "Not as a plan, just a thinking about it. If you wanted to." He paused. "The house is bigger now than it was, and the ranch is steady." She considered him, this man who had been with her now for 6 years, who had proven himself consistent and real in every season and every circumstance, and she thought about what it meant that he could say this to her as a gentle wondering rather than a demand or a need, that it could be between them as a conversation rather than a negotiation. "Let me think about it," she said. "That is all I am asking," he said, which was what he always said, and it was always true, and she loved him for it always. She thought about it through the fall and into the winter, and in February of 1890 she told him that yes, she thought so, and she watched his face do the thing it did, the opening up, the light coming into it, and she thought that after 7 years she still found this face astonishing. The second child, a girl this time, was born in November of 1890, delivered again by Mrs. Garrett with the same matter-of-fact competence. Clara, now 17 and preparing for her departure to Santa Fe in the spring, was present in the house, and James, now 5, was outside with Robert Day, who had been conscripted into the role of child watcher and was carrying it out with good-natured incompetence. The baby was small and fierce and dark-haired, and announced her opinions from the first breath with considerable volume. Aaron held her with the careful steadiness of a man who has held one baby before and remembered what they require, and he looked from the baby to Ida with an expression that was, if possible, even more helplessly open than the first time. "She looks like you," he said. "She has your frown," Ida said, which was what she had said about James, and Aaron laughed, and Mrs. Garrett made a sound of approval. They named her Margaret after Ida's mother, who had died years before and who had been a woman of considerable backbone that Ida had always wanted to honor. Margaret Clara Aaron Barker, which was too many names for one small person but felt right. Clara came in and looked at her sister with the same expression she had applied to James 9 years before, serious and assessing, and then said, "She is very loud." "She is perfect," Aaron said. "She is very loud and she is very perfect," Clara corrected, which satisfied everyone. The winter of 1890 settled around the ranch with its usual cold clarity, and inside the house there was the particular organized chaos of an infant in a household, with a 5-year-old and a nearly adult daughter and 2 adults who had long since figured out how to operate as a unit. The chaos was not small, but it was warm, and Ida moved through it with the practiced ease of a woman in her own life, not maintaining it from the outside but living it from the inside. Clara left for Santa Fe in the spring of 1891, on a morning in March when the sky was that impossible blue again, the blue of her parents' wedding day. Aaron drove her to the stage in Morrow Creek, and James sat in the back of the wagon with Margaret in his lap, holding his baby sister with the careful pride of a 5-year-old who has been told he is responsible for her, and Ida sat next to Aaron on the bench and watched the road. At the stage, Clara embraced her mother and held on for a moment longer than usual, and Ida held on back, and they were both Whitfield women, which meant neither of them cried in public, but it was close. Clara embraced Aaron and said something quietly into his shoulder, and Aaron held her with the straightforward paternal love of a man who has been a father in all the ways that matter for 6 years, and when she stepped back his eyes were bright. "I will write every week," Clara said. "We will expect you to," Ida said. The stage pulled away and they watched it go, and the morning was clear and cold, and Margaret made an indignant noise from the back of the wagon, and James said, "She wants you, Mama," with the authority of a 5-year-old expert, and Ida turned back to the wagon and the life in it, and Aaron put his arm around her shoulders briefly before climbing back up to the bench. "She will be extraordinary," he said. "I know," Ida said. "I always knew." The letters came every week as promised. Clara wrote with the precision and the warmth that she brought to everything, describing her training, her fellow students, the city of Santa Fe, which she found both overwhelming and exhilarating, the school program and its requirements. She was, as her parents had predicted, and as she had always been, excellent at everything she applied herself to, and the reports from her instructor were uniformly positive. She came home in September of 1891 as a qualified teacher, and Morrow Creek School took her on without hesitation, and she stood at the front of that schoolroom with her mother's exactness and her stepfather's patience and her own particular fire, and the children of Morrow Creek were the beneficiaries. The years moved forward. Margaret grew from an opinionated infant into an opinionated child, dark-haired and vivid, absolutely certain of herself in a way that made Aaron frequently look at Ida with an expression that said, "She gets this from you." And Ida looked back with an expression that said, "She gets this from both of us." James, at 10, was the ranch's most enthusiastic amateur horseman, and Aaron's shadow from the moment school ended each day, absorbing everything about the cattle operation with the serious intention of someone who already knows what they want their life to look like. Calls the Winds family remained their neighbors, and the water arrangement continued to hold. Morning Star and Ida had developed over the years a quiet understanding, two women on adjacent pieces of difficult land, and they exchanged things occasionally, seeds from Ida's vegetable garden that did particularly well, knowledge about the land's seasonal behavior that Morning Star carried from her people's generations of knowing this country. It was not a profound friendship in the way that people with more leisure and less practical urgency might form, but it was real and it was mutual, and in a time when such exchanges between white settlers and native people were almost non-existent, it was something. The century moved toward its end. The territory was changing, more people, more organization, more of the inevitable encroachment of the kind of civilization that replaced the particular rawness of the frontier with something more orderly and less alive. The railroad had come through and changed the economics of ranching and the geography of daily life, and Ida had seen it clearly in the accounts before Aaron had fully registered it, as she tended to. She adapted the operations approach accordingly, contracting differently, diversifying slightly into horses, which Aaron knew more than cattle and which the new conditions favored. The Barker Ranch grew not rich but solidly prosperous, the kind of prosperity that is built on competent decisions rather than luck, on work rather than circumstance. Clara, teaching in Morrow Creek and living in the town, married a man named Henry Carr in the spring of 1895, a carpenter from Colorado who had come through and stayed, a quiet and decent man with steady hands who looked at Clara Whitfield Barker with the uncomplicated regard of someone who understood what he had found. Ida watched their wedding with Aaron's hand in hers and felt the particular emotion of a parent watching a child make a good choice, the emotion that is made up of so many things at once, pride and relief, and the specific joy of seeing someone move into their own happiness. "You are thinking about the broken axle again," Aaron said quietly, next to her, not looking away from the ceremony. She turned to him, startled. "How did you know?" He looked at her then with that expression that had been part of her life for more than 12 years now, that cherishing, certain look. "Because you had that face," he said. "The one you get when you are thinking about how things connect." "How things connect," she repeated. "Clara standing there today," he said, "because you were standing by a broken wagon in 1883, because you were brave enough to say yes to something that frightened you." He paused. "It all connects." She looked at him in the light of the church, this man, this Aaron Barker, who had appeared out of the dust of a road and offered her the exact truth of himself and a real life and nothing more, and had been as good as his word in every season since. "You say very good things," she said. "I learned from someone," he said. The evening after Clara's wedding, they sat on their finished porch, just the two of them, with Margaret asleep inside and James out with Robert Day at some social thing in town that involved young people and was presumably harmless. The spring night was warm and the territory lay around them under its stars, and the porch that Aaron had been building for 2 years when they met was solid under them, finished long ago, weathered now to a silver gray that was beautiful in its way. 32 years old, Ida said, thinking aloud. I stood at Thomas's grave and decided I was done with hope. And, Aaron said. She looked at him in the dark. This man she had spent 12 years learning to let fully in. This man who had been right that she was more alive than she had been allowing herself to be. This man who had offered her not a fairy tale but an actual life with all its difficulty and all its goodness braided together. And I was magnificently wrong, she said. He took her hand the way he had taken it on the unfinished porch in the rain-damp morning all those years ago, with that same firmness and gentleness combined, and they sat together in the dark while the stars did what they always do over the territory, which is to say they were extravagant and indifferent and beautiful, and the ranch breathed around them in the night. James came home at 10 o'clock making a reasonable amount of noise, which meant everything was fine, and he stuck his head out the door and said good night to them, both in the way he had always done, easily and without embarrassment, the way of a child who has grown up in a house where affection was present and consistent. Margaret called out from her bedroom that she needed water, which was Margaret's standard delaying tactic and which fooled no one. I will go, Aaron said and stood, and squeezed her hand before releasing it. Ida sat on the porch alone for a moment, listening to his boots on the floor inside, hearing his voice say gently to their daughter that it was sleep time now, hearing Margaret's brief negotiation and his patient response, hearing the quiet settle back over the house. She looked out at the land. Her land and his land, their land, the 40 acres she had held onto through everything, and the ranch he had been building when they met, now worked together and shaped by both of them into something neither could have made alone. The land was dark and enormous and full of whatever the land is always full of, the patience of it, the permanence of it, the way it was here before any of them and would be here after. She thought of the woman in the black funeral bonnet standing at the grave in the bleaching sun, and she felt nothing but tenderness toward her, that frightened and armored and fiercely competent woman who had decided that survival was enough, that maintaining was the best she could ask for. She did not blame her. She understood her completely. She had been her, and she had found, in the particular grace of an ordinary afternoon on a dusty road, a way out of her that did not require giving up any of what she had fought to keep. Aaron came back out and sat beside her again, and she leaned into him, and he put his arm around her and they watched the stars. Tell me something, she said. What would you like to hear? She thought about it. Tell me what you thought the first time you saw me. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. I saw a woman standing next to a broken wagon with her hands on her hips, he said, doing the arithmetic of a difficult situation, not looking for help, not looking lost, just figuring it out. He paused. I thought, there is a woman who has been through something, and I thought, there is a woman I would like to know. She turned her face up to look at him. That is all. That was the beginning, he said. The rest took longer to identify. What was the rest? He looked at her with that expression, the one she had catalogued and named and that still, after all these years, had the power to move something in her chest. The rest was everything, he said simply. She kissed him there on the finished porch under the enormous stars, the way you kiss someone after 12 years of knowing them, with all the history of it and all the present of it and all the future of it together, a kiss that had the weight of a life in it. Inside, Margaret had gone quiet, finally asleep. James had turned his lamp down. The ranch was settled in the dark, the cattle patient in the pasture, the horses still in the barn, the whole operation at rest after the day's work. It was ordinary. It was exactly as ordinary as a life should be, and in its ordinariness it was the most extraordinary thing she had ever known, this actual life that had been offered to her by a man with steady hands and honest eyes who had asked nothing she could not give and had given everything he had promised. Ida Whitfield Barker sat on her porch under the stars of New Mexico Territory in the last years of the 19th century, with her husband's arm around her and her children asleep inside, and her daughter married and beginning her own life. And she felt the fullness of it all the way down, to the place in her chest where she had once kept the armor, and where now there was simply room, open and warm and entirely hers. And she thought that this was what it felt like to be completely alive in a life you had chosen with your eyes open. Not a fairy tale, better than a fairy tale, a life.